When people talk about great sex, they usually get it wrong. They focus on technique, novelty, or performance. But that's not what most men remember or crave. What actually makes sex great for men is surprisingly simple and deeply human. It's about presence, not perfection. It's about being wanted, not tolerated. It's about safety, emotional safety without judgment, and it's about polarity, the kind that creates chemistry without trying to dominate or disappear. In this talk, I'm going to break down 4 truths men rarely say out loud, not to manipulate, but to understand. Because when intimacy works, it's not confusing, it's honest. When people hear the phrase great sex, their minds usually jump to performance, technique, novelty, something that can be learned, optimized, or perfected. That framing is understandable. We live in a culture that treats almost everything as a skill to be mastered, but it misses something fundamental. Because for most men, what determines whether sex is truly great isn't what happens mechanically. It's what happens psychologically. And at the center of that is presence. Presence is one of those words that sounds vague until you really sit with it. It doesn't mean enthusiasm in the exaggerated sense. It doesn't mean constant affirmation or dramatic expression. Presence simply means being there, mentally, emotionally, attentively. It means your attention isn't split between the moment and your self-consciousness, or the moment and your anxieties, or the moment and the running commentary in your head about how you look, how you're being perceived, or whether you're doing things right. From a psychological standpoint, presence is rare. Most people are not present most of the time. We're distracted, guarded, performing, or bracing for judgment. Intimacy exposes that more than almost anything else, and men feel it immediately. They may not articulate it clearly, but they know when the person they're with is actually there versus when they're acting a role. When a woman is present, she's not trying to manage the experience from the outside. She's not narrating herself internally. She's not constantly checking in with how she's being evaluated. Instead, she's responding. She's allowing herself to experience what's happening in real time. That responsiveness creates feedback. It creates connection. It creates a sense of mutual participation rather than one person performing and the other observing. This matters because men are highly sensitive to rejection, even in subtle forms. Distraction can feel like rejection. Emotional distance can feel like rejection. Going through the motions can feel like rejection. When presence is missing, men often interpret it, consciously or not, as disinterest, obligation, or disengagement, and that shuts something down internally. Desire fades not because the situation lacks stimulation, but because it lacks reciprocity. There's also a deeper philosophical layer here. Presence communicates consent at a level beyond words. It says, I'm choosing to be here with you now. That choice is powerful. For men, being chosen is far more meaningful than being accommodated. Presence signals that choice repeatedly, moment by moment, and that's what makes it memorable. From a neurological perspective, presence affects arousal through safety. The nervous system responds to cues of attunement. When someone is present, their micro responses, eye contact, breathing, timing, touch, are synchronized. That synchrony tells the brain that this is a safe interaction. Safety allows relaxation. Relaxation allows desire to deepen. Without safety, the body stays guarded, even if the situation appears intimate on the surface. This is why performance often backfires. When someone is overly focused on doing a good job, they're not present. They're monitoring themselves. They're anticipating outcomes. They're trying to control perception. Ironically, that effort creates distance. Men don't experience that as competence, they experience it as absence. Something essential is missing. Presence also removes the pressure of expectation. Many men carry an unspoken fear of failing, of not being enough, not performing well enough, not living up to an imagined standard. When the person they're with is present rather than evaluative, that fear softens. They're no longer being measured, they're being met. That changes everything. It's important to understand that presence isn't passive. It's not lying there and calling it authenticity. Presence is active engagement. It's curiosity. It's responsiveness. It's allowing yourself to feel without trying to control the outcome. That kind of engagement requires courage because it means letting go of self-protection. And courage is attractive, not because it's flashy, but because it's honest. Men often describe great sex in surprisingly understated terms. They'll say things like, it just felt easy, or it felt natural, or I didn't have to think. Those descriptions are pointing directly at presence. When both people are present, effort disappears. Time compresses. The experience feels coherent instead of fragmented. That coherence is what stays with people long after the moment itself has passed. There's also a relational implication. Presence signals respect. It says, "You matter enough for my full attention." In a world where attention is constantly pulled in a dozen directions, that's not trivial. For men whose emotional needs are often dismissed or minimized, that kind of attention can be profoundly grounding. Presence also allows for authenticity. When you're present, you're not trying to be what you think the other person wants. You're being what you are in that moment. That authenticity creates trust, and trust amplifies intimacy. Without trust, intimacy becomes fragile, conditional, or performative. It's worth noting that presence can't be faked for long. People can sense incongruence. If your words say one thing but your attention says another, the attention wins. This is why developing presence isn't about learning tricks. It's about removing obstacles, anxiety, self-judgment, distraction that prevent you from being where you already are. This ties into something larger about modern life. We're constantly encouraged to live in abstraction, future plans, past regrets, imagined judgments. Presence pulls us back into reality. And reality, when shared honestly, is far more compelling than any performance. When presence is there, men don't feel like they're taking something. They feel like they're participating in something mutual. That distinction matters. Desire rooted in mutual participation feels clean. Desire rooted in obligation or validation feels heavy. Presence keeps desire clean. And here's the part that often surprises people. Presence isn't about doing more. It's about subtracting. Subtracting self-consciousness, subtracting scripts, subtracting the need to manage perception. What's left is attention, and attention, when freely given, is one of the most powerful forms of intimacy there is. This is why presence naturally connects to the other points we'll talk about: being chosen, emotional safety, and polarity. Presence is the foundation. Without it, the rest collapses into theory. With it, everything else becomes possible. If there's one thing to take away from this, it's simple but not easy. Great intimacy begins when you stop trying to create an experience and start fully inhabiting the one you're already in. When you do that, you're no longer performing connection, you're allowing it. And that shift changes not just how sex feels, but how relationships function at their core. If presence is the foundation, then being chosen is the meaning built on top of it. This is where things become uncomfortable because it forces us to confront motivations rather than behaviors. Men rarely talk openly about this, not because it isn't important, but because it's vulnerable. Yet again and again, when you strip away the surface explanations, what most men want in intimacy is not access, not compliance, not even enthusiasm in the performative sense. They want to feel chosen. That word matters. Chosen implies agency. It implies desire that originates internally rather than being extracted through pressure, expectation, or obligation. And psychologically, the difference between being chosen and being tolerated is enormous. One affirms value, the other quietly erodes it. Many men grow up learning that their worth is conditional. They are valued for what they provide, what they accomplish, what they endure. Emotional needs are often dismissed or reframed as weakness. Over time, this creates a quiet hunger, not just for intimacy, but for affirmation that isn't transactional. Sex becomes one of the few places where that affirmation seems possible, but only if it's real. When intimacy feels like duty, men feel it immediately. Even if nothing is said, even if everything looks fine on the surface, obligation has a texture. It's heavy, it's constrained, it carries resentment or indifference beneath politeness. And when a man senses he's being accommodated rather than desired, something shuts down. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it shows up as withdrawal, irritability, or emotional distance. But the underlying message is the same: I'm here because I have to be, not because I want to be. That message cuts deeper than people realize, because it doesn't just affect the moment. It reshapes how a man sees himself in the relationship. If intimacy is granted rather than chosen, it reinforces the idea that his value is negotiable, that he has to earn closeness through effort, patience, or silence. Over time, this corrodes trust and desire simultaneously. From a philosophical perspective, being chosen affirms personhood. It says you are not interchangeable, desire directed at you specifically, not just at the role you play or the stability you provide, creates meaning. And meaning is what sustains long-term intimacy. Without it, sex becomes mechanical, even if it remains frequent. This is why men often respond more strongly to small signals of genuine desire than to elaborate gestures. A look, initiation, spontaneity, not because of ego, but because these signals bypass obligation. They say, I want you, without justification. That kind of desire is grounding. It removes the need to question motives. It allows a man to relax into the experience rather than analyzing whether he's imposing or being indulged. There's also an important distinction between being wanted and being needed. Being needed can feel flattering at first, but it's unstable. Needs change. Circumstances shift. Desire, when freely chosen, is more resilient. Men sense this difference intuitively. When intimacy is driven by need, loneliness, reassurance, fear of abandonment, it carries pressure. When it's driven by desire, it carries energy. Psychologically, desire that is freely given creates positive feedback. A man who feels chosen is more present, more generous, more attentive, more emotionally available. Not because he's trying to secure future access, but because he feels safe enough to invest. Safety and desire reinforce each other when choice is clear. This connects directly to self-respect. Men want to feel that intimacy isn't something they have to negotiate for or justify. When desire is offered freely, it communicates respect. It says, I see you as someone worth wanting. That message is stabilizing in a way compliments rarely are. It's worth addressing a common misconception here. Feeling chosen doesn't mean constant validation or pursuit. It doesn't mean eliminating boundaries or saying yes when you don't mean it. In fact, the opposite is true. Choice only has meaning when no is real. Desire is only authentic when refusal is possible. Men can tell when consent is diluted by guilt, fear, or expectation, and diluted consent doesn't feel good, it feels unsettling. This is where honesty becomes essential. If desire isn't there, pretending it is doesn't preserve harmony, it erodes trust. Men would rather face disappointment than live inside ambiguity. Clear signals, even difficult ones, are easier to integrate than mixed messages. Ambiguity forces interpretation, and interpretation breeds insecurity. There's also a cultural layer to this. Many people are taught to treat sex as a resource to be managed, given strategically, withheld strategically, negotiated implicitly. That framing turns intimacy into leverage. And leverage destroys the experience of being chosen, because choice becomes suspect. Was this desire, or was it strategy? That question alone is enough to disrupt connection. Men don't want to feel like they're taking something that isn't freely offered. That creates moral tension. Desire that is chosen removes that tension. It allows intimacy to feel clean, mutual, and affirmative rather than fraught. When men describe relationships where sex felt deeply fulfilling, they often talk less about frequency and more about tone. They say things like, she wanted me, or I never felt like I was asking for too much, or it felt mutual. Those statements point directly to choice, to desire that didn't need to be extracted or earned. This also explains why rejection, when handled honestly, can be less damaging than reluctant compliance. Reluctant compliance keeps a man physically close but psychologically isolated. Honest rejection preserves dignity on both sides. It says, this isn't about your worth. It's about my truth. That distinction matters more than people realize. Being chosen also intersects with identity. For many men, sexual desire is one of the few places where they feel unambiguously wanted for who they are, not what they do. When that space becomes conditional or transactional, it leaves a void that often gets misinterpreted as anger, detachment, or restlessness. But beneath that is grief. The grief of not being desired as a person. This is why trying to use sex as currency almost always backfires. It replaces desire with control, and control, while it may produce short-term compliance, destroys long-term intimacy. Men don't feel close to people who control access to desire. They feel managed by them. Choice, freely expressed, does something very different. It invites reciprocity. It encourages responsibility. It makes intimacy a shared creation rather than a negotiated outcome. And again, this flows naturally into the other points. Emotional safety becomes possible when desire is freely chosen. Polarity emerges when each person feels secure enough to inhabit their role without resentment. But without choice, everything else becomes brittle. If there's a single reflection to leave you with here, it's this: intimacy doesn't deepen when it's granted. It deepens when it's chosen. When desire is honest and freely offered, it doesn't just change how sex feels, it changes how people show up for each other. And that choice, repeated over time, is what turns connection into something that actually lasts. Once presence is established and desire is freely chosen, something else becomes possible. Something that determines whether intimacy deepens or quietly collapses over time. That something is emotional safety. And this is where many conversations about sex become misleading, because safety is often misunderstood as comfort or agreement or the absence of tension. That's not what it means here. Emotional safety in this context is the absence of judgment. For many men, intimacy is one of the most psychologically exposed places they will ever enter, not because of vulnerability in the stereotypical sense, but because it touches identity, masculinity, competence, worth, desirability. All of it is implicitly on the line. Even confident men carry this exposure, often especially confident men, because they're expected to be unshakable. What most men fear in intimate moments isn't rejection alone, it's evaluation. Being watched, measured, compared, or silently graded. That fear doesn't always register consciously, but it shapes behavior. It creates tension, and tension is the enemy of desire. When a man feels judged, his nervous system shifts into defense. He becomes less expressive, less spontaneous, more guarded, not because he doesn't care, but because he's protecting himself. Judgment, whether explicit or subtle, signals danger, and in danger, the body doesn't open, it contracts. This is why emotional safety isn't about constant reassurance. It's about neutrality. It's about not turning intimacy into a performance review. Small cues matter here: sighs, eye rolls, comparisons, corrective comments, delivered at the wrong time. Even well-intentioned feedback can land as criticism if it carries the implication that he's failing some unspoken standard. Men often internalize these moments deeply. They may not argue or explain. Instead, they adjust. They become quieter, more mechanical, less present. Over time, intimacy loses its vitality, not because attraction disappeared, but because expression became risky. From a psychological standpoint, judgment triggers shame, and shame shuts down desire faster than almost anything else. Shame tells a person that something about them, not just their behavior, is deficient. For men whose identities are often closely tied to competence and effectiveness, sexual shame can be particularly corrosive. This is why emotional safety doesn't mean pretending everything is perfect. It means choosing when and how truth is spoken. It means understanding that intimacy is not the place for scorekeeping or subtle power struggles. When intimacy becomes a place where mistakes are punished, emotionally or relationally, men learn to minimize risk. And minimizing risk means minimizing connection. There's a philosophical dimension to this as well. Judgment reduces a person to an object. It places the observer above the observed. Safety restores equality. It says, we're in this together, not measuring each other from a distance. That equality is essential for genuine intimacy. Without it, one person performs and the other evaluates. And performance, again, replaces presence. Many men don't feel emotionally safe expressing uncertainty, desire, or even pleasure. They worry about being perceived as inexperienced, excessive, inadequate, or selfish. When those concerns are confirmed, even indirectly, it reinforces the belief that vulnerability is dangerous. So they retreat behind control or detachment. Emotional safety allows something different. It allows play. And play is a marker of health in any intimate system. Play requires trust. It requires the freedom to experiment without fear of ridicule or consequence. When men feel safe, they become more creative, more expressive, more attuned, not because they're trying harder, but because they're less afraid. It's important to understand that safety doesn't eliminate polarity or tension. In fact, it enables it. When a man doesn't feel judged, he can relax into his role. He doesn't have to prove anything. He doesn't have to anticipate correction. That relaxation allows confidence to emerge naturally rather than defensively. This is also where many well-meaning conversations go wrong. People assume that pointing out flaws will motivate improvement. But in intimate contexts, it often does the opposite. It narrows behavior instead of expanding it. Men don't become better lovers by feeling inadequate. They become better lovers by feeling secure enough to explore. Safety also affects how men interpret feedback. In a safe environment, guidance can be received as collaboration. In an unsafe one, the same words feel like indictment. The difference isn't content, it's tone, timing, and underlying intent. Men are acutely sensitive to whether feedback is meant to connect or control. There's also a long-term relational effect. When emotional safety is absent, men often compartmentalize. They separate sex from emotion, or they disengage emotionally while remaining physically present. This creates confusion for both partners. It looks like distance, but it's actually self-protection. Safety, on the other hand, allows integration. Desire and emotion reinforce each other rather than competing. Men feel more connected not because they're being asked to open up, but because they're allowed to without consequence. One of the least discussed aspects of emotional safety is forgiven. Men will make mistakes. They will misread signals. They will say the wrong thing. When those moments are met with contempt or stored as evidence, safety erodes. When they're met with proportion and perspective, trust grows. Forgiveness doesn't mean ignoring patterns. It means responding to errors without turning them into identity judgments. There's also something deeply stabilizing about knowing that intimacy isn't conditional on perfection. When men feel that connection will be withdrawn if they fall short, desire becomes anxious. When they feel accepted even when imperfect, desire becomes grounded. This connects directly to the earlier point about being chosen. Choice that is conditional feels precarious. Choice that coexists with safety feels real. It says, you are wanted as you are, not as you perform. And again, safety is not softness without boundaries. It's clarity without cruelty. It's honesty without contempt. Men respect boundaries when they're expressed cleanly. What they struggle with is mixed messaging, affection layered with judgment, desire layered with resentment. That inconsistency keeps them on edge. When emotional safety is present, men don't have to monitor themselves constantly. They don't have to anticipate criticism. That mental quiet allows attention to return to the moment, to presence, to reciprocity, to connection. This is why emotional safety is often invisible until it's gone. When it's there, intimacy feels natural. When it's absent, everything feels effortful. People start asking what's wrong. When the real question is, where did it stop feeling safe to be real? Safety also creates durability. Relationships inevitably face stress, fatigue, and change. When emotional safety exists, those challenges don't destroy intimacy. They test it and often deepen it. When safety is absent, even minor issues can feel catastrophic. Men often criticized for withdrawing rather than explaining, but withdrawal is frequently a response to environments that feel unsafe for expression. When safety returns, communication often follows naturally. This point ties the entire framework together. Presence becomes possible when judgment fades. Choice feels meaningful when safety exists. Polarity thrives when both people feel secure enough to inhabit their strengths without fear. So here's the reflection to leave you with. Intimacy doesn't collapse because people stop caring. It collapses when it stops feeling safe to be imperfect. If you want deeper connection, start by removing judgment from the places where vulnerability matters most. Safety doesn't weaken desire, it liberates it. When presence is established, desire is freely chosen, and emotional safety exists, something almost inevitable begins to emerge. It's not manufactured, it's not forced, it arises naturally from the dynamic itself. That something is polarity, and this is often the most misunderstood element of intimacy because it's been distorted by caricatures, dominance versus submission, strength versus weakness, control versus compliance. None of those frames are accurate, and all of them miss the point. Polarity is about contrast. It's about difference that creates attraction rather than competition. And psychologically, human beings respond to contrast instinctively. We notice light because there is darkness. We feel movement because there is stillness. Intimacy works the same way. When two people occupy complementary energies rather than mirroring each other constantly, something alive happens between them. For many men, great sex isn't about power over someone else. It's about the freedom to inhabit strength without being punished for it. That strength doesn't have to be aggressive or domineering. Often it's quiet, directional, grounded. It's the feeling of being able to lead, initiate, or hold space without being questioned, corrected, or diminished. What makes this possible is softness on the other side. Not weakness, not passivity, but receptivity. openness, warmth, the willingness to respond rather than compete. When softness meets strength, both are amplified. Strength becomes protective rather than rigid. Softness becomes magnetic rather than fragile. This is where many modern relationships struggle. There's a fear of asymmetry. People worry that difference implies inequality. But polarity isn't about one person having more value than the other. It's about playing different roles within the same shared reality. When both roles are respected, neither feels diminished. Men often experience a subtle but persistent pressure to neutralize themselves, to soften their edges, dilute their assertiveness, or second-guess their instincts to avoid being seen as too much. Over time, that pressure erodes desire, not because men want to dominate, but because they want to express energy without being shamed for it. Polarity allows that expression. It says, you can be what you are here. And when that permission exists, men often become calmer, more attentive, and more emotionally available. Strength no longer has to prove itself. It can simply exist. From a psychological standpoint, polarity reduces internal conflict. When a man feels he must suppress parts of himself to maintain harmony, desire becomes divided. Part of him wants connection, part of him feels constrained. Polarity resolves that tension by allowing difference to coexist without threat. It's important to emphasize that polarity isn't fixed to gender in a rigid way. But in heterosexual dynamics, there are patterns that show up repeatedly because of biological, psychological, and cultural influences. Ignoring those patterns doesn't make them disappear, it just makes them harder to navigate. Men are often oriented toward direction, problem solving, and action. When those tendencies are welcomed rather than resisted, they become assets rather than sources of conflict. When they're constantly challenged, corrected, or neutralized, men don't become more cooperative, they become disengaged. Polarity also creates anticipation. When energy flows between opposites, there's movement. There's tension in the best sense, something unresolved, something alive. That tension is the engine of desire. Without it, intimacy becomes flat, even if everything else is technically healthy. This is why relationships that emphasize sameness above all else often struggle with passion. Sameness creates stability, but it can also create stasis. Polarity introduces motion. It allows people to lean into who they are without collapsing into competition. Men respond strongly to feeling that their strength is not only accepted but welcomed. That doesn't mean unquestioned authority. It means trust. Trust that their direction isn't inherently oppressive. Trust that their confidence isn't a threat. When that trust exists, men are more likely to listen, adjust, and care, not because they're being managed, but because they're invested. Softness plays a crucial role here. Softness is not indecision, it's responsiveness. It's the ability to receive without defensiveness. For men, softness on the other side creates relief. It balances intensity. It gives strength somewhere to land. This balance is deeply regulating at a nervous system level. When polarity is present, both people feel oriented. Roles aren't rigid, but they're clear. Clarity reduces anxiety, and reduced anxiety allows desire to flow. Polarity also prevents resentment. When people suppress their natural tendencies to avoid conflict, resentment accumulates quietly. When polarity is allowed, expression replaces suppression. Desire stays clean instead of becoming tangled with frustration. There's also a philosophical dimension to polarity. It reflects a broader truth about meaning itself. Meaning arises from the interplay of difference, not from uniformity. When everything is the same, nothing stands out. When difference is respected, relationship becomes dynamic rather than static. Men don't want to feel like they have to negotiate every instinct. They want spaces where initiative is appreciated, not interrogated. When that space exists, intimacy feels expansive rather than constrained. It's worth noting that polarity doesn't survive without the earlier elements we discussed. Without presence, polarity becomes performative. Without choice, it becomes coercive. Without emotional safety, it becomes brittle. Polarity only thrives when the foundation is solid. When all four elements align, something rare happens. Intimacy stops feeling like work. It stops feeling like negotiation. It becomes a place of restoration rather than depletion. Men often describe this state indirectly. They say things like, I feel like myself with her, or I don't have to hold back, or everything just flows. Those statements point directly to polarity functioning well. And when polarity is absent, men often struggle to articulate what's wrong. They just know that desire has faded, even though nothing obvious is broken. What's missing isn't love or commitment, it's contrast. Reintroducing polarity isn't about acting out stereotypes. It's about allowing difference to breathe. It's about letting each person bring their natural orientation into the relationship without fear. When polarity is healthy, both people grow. Strength becomes more refined. Softness becomes more confident. Each sharpens the other rather than dulling it. So if there's one final thought to leave you with, this. Intimacy doesn't deepen when we erase our differences. It deepens when we learn to meet across them. When strength and softness are allowed to coexist without shame, desire doesn't have to be manufactured. It emerges. And when it emerges naturally, it has the power to sustain connection far beyond the moment itself.